All right, and so welcome back. We're pretty much rounding up, just finalizing this asset here and the material that we wanted to create. But we still got a few more things, a few more topics to cover that I really think are going to put our skills to the next level. And one of those topics that I want to discuss in this video is the topic of decals or decals or whatever you want to call them, but essentially just new geometry that we're creating entirely from a texture. And so we're going to be able to create this kind of button slash light object entirely out of images and textures. And we're not going to actually need to use any geometry or bake any high poly mesh to get this information. And so this is really cool. It's a kind of neat setup that allows us to then further use our materials and our textures to create new and interesting kind of surfaces for our assets. So I'm not going to talk too much longer. Let's just get right into that. So I'm going to come up to our package and create a new substance graph. And so now I'm not going to use our template down here because I'm not going to be bringing things in and manipulating our inputs or anything, because I don't want to bring any of this stuff into the graph like a filter. Instead, I want it to be its own standalone asset that we're then going to use to blend onto our filters down here, our layers, using external blends in our parent graph here. So we're just going to take a look at that and see kind of the differences of constructing our graph that way. So I'm going to come back up to the top with our PBR metallic roughness. And I'm going to call this guy light decal. And we're going to click OK. And that's going to give us just a blank looking graph here with all of our outputs. And so the first thing I want to do with this is I actually want to change my 3D mesh, because when we're trying to construct this new geometry, what we're going to do is essentially just lay everything down smack dab in the middle of our texture set. But if you remember, our UVs on our asset here are all over this texture set. So we're going to have a heck of a time trying to figure out constructing this when we've got a little bit of it over here and some over here, and then a whole lot of it down here. So instead, I'm just going to come up and change the scene to our rounded cube so that we're going to be able to take a look at just a flat surface while we're actually constructing this, and then be able to overlay whatever we construct in this graph onto our mesh once we're completed with it. All right, and so with that, again, I'm going to come down and I'm just going to get rid of our height there. And I'm going to leave our metallic as black, leave our roughness as black, our normal and our base color for right now. And we're going to go ahead and just start constructing height information. Now, I just deleted our height output, but that doesn't mean that we still don't need to use some height information, some grayscale information to construct the other aspects of our material, such as our normal or our ambient occlusion, right? So with that, I'm just going to come over here and I'm going to create a shape node. And I'm going to plug this guy into our ambient occlusion here and into our normal. And so I'm going to get rid of this guy here. So far, everything should stay the same. But if I come into my shape and I change my shape to a paraboloid, now you can see that we're going to get this guy here. And it's going to have a little bit of normals on it. And again, you can see the areas that are black in our texture set here are going to basically be entirely enshrouded in shadow. So to fix that, all I'm going to do is just on this guy here, type AO to get an ambient occlusion node. And that's going to help just normalize our texture here to be considered an ambient occlusion texture set. So it's not going to take our black value here and just completely crunch it into shadows. I'm also going to come to our normal here and just change this to something like 5 for now, just to give us a little bit more normal information there. All right. And so I want to go ahead and start creating both the perimeter of our button, kind of the cylindrical surrounding piece of our button, as well as the actual geometry of the button itself. And so to do that, I'm going to kind of branch off into two different streams and then come back in together and blend them together so that at the end of the day, we're only using this one node to create the entirety of our button. And if we scale it up and down, the button will scale accordingly. So we only need to, again, use one slider here to determine how big our button is actually going to be. And so with that, I'm going to actually change the scale to something like 0.33, just something nice and small. Gives us a good range to go up or down if we want to later. And now I'm going to drag this guy off and do a transform node. And so this is going to start kind of the split of our tree here before we come back together. So I'm also going to, on this guy, create a curve and then just make sure to plug this guy back in. I'm also going to create a curve node on this guy here. Whoops. And then I'm going to create a blend, and then I'm going to blend these back in together. So that's a lot that's just happened right now, and we really haven't done all that much. And so we're going to go ahead and take a look at what we're doing with these. So I first want to change my blend mode to be subtract. And so what we're going to do is I'm going to use this guy here as our perimeter. So we're going to try and keep the outside of this circle here to be used as the perimeter of the button. And I'm going to use this guy here to actually subtract from the center. So we can kind of eat away from the center of this primitive here. But to do that, I actually need to decrease the size a little bit because we're essentially just taking a curve or a grayscale image here and deleting it over top of the same image, right? So we need to do some alterations to the top image first in order to see our results down in our blend here. So with that, I'm going to just select our transform. I'm going to make sure that we aren't tiling anything. And now I'm going to start just slowly bringing this guy down here. Again, holding shift to control the aspect ratio and making sure that I just reset these to 0 every time, just so that we're centering our texture in the middle of our button there. And again, we can also use the stretch option here, but I find that it can be a little bit finicky at the best of times. And if I just want to scale up and down just to get minute changes, it's a little bit difficult. So I'm going to, actually we'll look at it this way here. And so now we're going to be able to play around with kind of the thickness of our perimeter here. And I might want something a little bit thicker. So I'll scale it in. Just make sure to center this out. And so I kind of like the thickness of that perimeter there. But you can see that now, right, we have it so that it's kind of coming up, but then it's kind of just smooth back into it. And I want to have a little bit more of a drop down there and kind of get rid of a lot of this area so that it's just flat, so that we're going to be able to easily put our button over top of this geometry when we're, again, blending it down the line. So I can come into my curve, and this is where it's going to allow me to play around with the gradient of our subtractor here. And this is where a lot of the fun in shape design really comes from. So if we take a look at our blend here, and I'm clicking back on my curve, you can see that as I double click, we can get a lot of different just looks and styles from just one point, right? And so this is really powerful to use in conjunction with gradients to really get some interesting kind of geometry without having to actually do any of this in 3D, right? This is all just a grayscale image and a gradient on a 2D plane. So I have a little bit of a setup with the curves that I want to use for the button that I'm making, but you're also free to kind of play around with it and figure out a look and a style that works for what you want to do. So I'm going to take this Bezier down here. I'm also going to take another guy down here to give us this kind of nice chamfer, right? As if it's come up and then gone down. And then I'm going to kind of softly just cut back into it there. And I'm going to play around with this just a little bit, bring this down a little bit more. And bring something out kind of like that, right? So that we get this nice perimeter piece, we get a little bit of an inset, and then we have another bit of a lip there. And the reason I have this curve down here is that we can also play around with the outside perimeter too by changing the curves on this guy, right? So if I come in here and play around with it now, you can see that we can also kind of give this a nice, clean chamfer. We can round it out a little bit, right? Make it a little bit more, a little fuller, a little bit more as if it's a gradual to sharp fall off right along the edges there. And I kind of like something like that, right? And we can also do some more artistic stuff where maybe we add another point here to get some more stepping kind of deal. Or if I bring this guy over here and put something over here, you can see that we can maybe even do something kind of like that where we add another lip, right? The possibilities with this node are pretty endless, so I encourage you to play around with it and see what kind of looks great for what you're doing. So I'm pretty happy with that right now. And I now need to go ahead and actually create the button itself, right? The center geometry there. So what I'm going to do with this is drag this out and add a, whoops, I keep doing that. Add another curve node. And on this guy, I'm going to add another blend. Bring this guy up here. And for this one, I'm going to do screen. And the reason I want to do screen, if we take a look here, right? We've got this darker area in the center. And I'm going to want to use this geometry as our button. And I'm going to play around again with the curves of it just to really fine tune the shape of this button. But I want to get rid of all the black values, right? So like we've been doing before, the screen blending option is going to allow us to get rid of all the darker values and only keep the lighter values. So now when I come in and play around with these curves here, you can see that we can really round it out, but that's, again, maybe a little bit too large of a circle here. You can see that while the space that we have to operate is only about this big, our circle actually extends the bounds of that a little bit. So I can also come in and tighten up the gradient of these, right? If I bring this in a little bit, and maybe I'll show the curve first, right? This is how we had it originally, but we can tighten up the curves, tighten up the size of it, and we can essentially just resize this as well using our curve node. So I really like the curve node, and I try and use it as much as possible. It just gives you full control over the gradients that you're working with. So I'm going to bring this in until we kind of have a little bit of a lip in between our button and our parameter there, our perimeter. I keep saying parameter. And now I just want to really round this out a little bit. Maybe bring this back in. Actually, I might just delete that guy, double click, and bring it back in just to get a clean curve. Maybe bring this guy down a little bit. So that we can do something kind of like that, right? So we get a nice curve there. Maybe play around with this a little bit more. Just to bring it in a little bit. There we go. So we're getting a nice distinct separation from the button and the actual the perimeter there. So now you can see the flexibility of this And we've only used one shape node to actually create this. So now if I come down and I play with the scale of our shape, you can see that our button is going to get bigger or smaller. And all we have to do is just use one slider to change this entire parameter without having to alter any of the setup that we've done. So I'm going to set this back to 0.33. And I can even come into our transform here and go, maybe I want this to be a little bit bigger. So I can just resize the actual distance that we have working with our outside bevel there. And so I'm going to use this as the basis for our geometry for this particular decal. And I want to go ahead and I want to add a little bit more normal information to our actual button or light here. So I'm going to just bring these guys back. And the first thing I want to do is I want to be able to isolate just the button so that I can use it for a mask, because I don't want to overlay this information that I'm about to create on the rest of the button perimeter there. So I'm going to come back and take a look, and the node that I have that is just entirely my button is this guy right here. But you can see that it's not going to be the best mask because it has a little bit of fall off on it that I'm not necessarily going to want. So I'm going to bring this guy out. I'm going to use a histogram scan node. And so what this does is it scans through a gradient from black to white, and it finds you all the values within that particular range. And so you can see if we take a look here, I scan through the position, right? We're going to be able to find the actual entirety of this image here for the values that are essentially non-black. So any value or any pixel that has a value that is not 000 or in the RGB spectrum there, or basically any value that is not in pure black, we're going to be able to find and mask off with this histogram scan here. So we're just going to put that aside for now and be able to use that guy as a mask. And so how I want to go about structuring this particular part is I want to just find the actual, is I want to create the normal information for the button, and then I want to blend that back in to our chain here, right, that we're stringing out to our outputs. So first I'm going to use a not a linear, a gradient linear 2. So again, we've seen this guy before for the rim, and we can see that as we increase the tiling up, we're going to get a bunch of different tiles. And I want to go ahead and I want to actually kind of make this look like it is a cylindrical pattern that we have on top of our button here. And so again, we've also seen how to take patterns in design and just kind of circleify that, if you will, right? And that node again is our Cartesian to polar grayscale. So you can see that we can take this pattern here and we can create a circle or spiral version of it. And again, if we play around with the rotation, we're just going to get a different kind of pattern. Now, this is not a pattern that we're going to be using, but it is just something to keep in mind that orientation of your input to this node does actually change the representation and the result of what the Cartesian node does to that information. So I'm going to bring this down back to 0 degrees, keep it on the horizontal direction. And so now I'm going to go ahead and blend this in. I'll take this guy and plug him in top, and you can see that's kind of the pattern we're going to get. And the blending mode that I want to use is going to be multiply. And you can see that, again, multiply is going to remove any of the lighter values and just kind of keep those darker ridges, right? Because I still want to keep the information of, you know, the roundedness and the height information of our button, but I want to add a little bit of crevices into that overall height information. And the reason that I've got this little mask here is so that we can just mask it off for our button. So it's not going to affect any of our perimeter here. And I'm going to go ahead and just bring our tiling up to something like 25. So it's a little bit smaller. And again, it's a little bit too harsh here. So I'm going to come into our blend and bring it down to maybe something like 0.2. And even that might be a little too harsh. Well, actually, you know what? It very well could be our ambient occlusion as well. Let's take a look. And yeah, you can see that our ambient occlusion is very, very dark. And again, this is just going to be a small little button or a small little light. But these are very, very dark shadows. So I want to come in and just change our height depth to something like, let's try 0.5. Oops, sorry, no, 0.05. Let's not get crazy. And 0.035. Something very light. We just want to have a little bit of occlusion there. So that's looking pretty cool, right? And so with very few nodes in the grand scheme of things, we've been able to create a pretty cool looking little piece of geometry there, right? And this is going to only require a couple more nodes to really become a fully fleshed out part of our material. So I want to go ahead now and start fleshing out some of these outputs here so that when we bring this into our parent graph, we're going to be able to use this to contribute to our base color, normal, metallic, and so on and so forth. So the first one I want to do is I actually want to go ahead and start declaring some metals on this guy to really help us see it a little bit better. And so in our metallic here, I'm going to obviously need to find a way to mask off the area that's metal from the area such as our button, which or our light here, which is not actually going to be metal. And so again, we've already kind of created that right here when we created this guy for our perimeter. And so I'm going to do the same thing we did up here, is just use a histogram scan here. If I do scan without an E, histogram scan, I bring the position all the way up. And you can see that we might have a little bit of issue because this is finding areas of our geometry, which is also part of our button. So we're going to need to come into here and we're just going to need to play around with our curves just a little bit. And again, finding parts of this mesh here. And so I'm just going to clean that guy right up. And so let's take a look here and just see in our actual output what this is going to look like. So I might want to just bring this guy in a little bit more just so we get a little bit closer to our button. And there we go. So we've essentially just created from a node that we've created down here for the geometry, a pretty effective mask because this is going to draw from whenever we alter that perimeter geometry, and it's going to automatically update for us when we output our normals. So I'm going to bring this guy and just place him conveniently over there. So now I can go in and start blocking in some colors for our little light here. So again, I'm going to create a uniform color here and change it from 2K down to 16 by 16. And getting rid of this guy here, plug him in. And this is going to be the color for my light. So I want my light to be kind of a nice red color, right? And now I'm going to have to mask off the rest of this material from our light. And the way that we can do that, obviously, is using the same exact mask that we've created over here. If I go ahead and create a blend, plugging this into the top, and then using this guy as a mask, now we're going to be able to mask off just our button here. And so now to play around with our metal colors, well, we've already played around with different kinds of metals in the past. I'm going to use the PBR metal reflectance value, and this is going to give us basically our pick or our choosing of which kind of metal we want the surrounding area of this light to be. So I'll plug this in and make sure again to just change the sizing of this guy. And I want to make sure that I just change this blend node to be relative to parent so that it will always be whatever the size of the graph is rather than our inputs here. And so this is going to allow us now to play around with the metal color, right? So I'm going to do something a little bit darker. Maybe we'll do titanium. Titanium looks kind of cool, right? And so now that's really helping us block in just kind of the look of our little button or light here. And since we've completed that, I can now come down and take a look at our roughness. Well, I want to use our normal map really to get a clear sense of what our roughness is going to be, because this is going to be such a small feature on our asset again, that giving it a really highly detailed and unique looking roughness map might be a little bit of wasted time and resolution space or texture space. So I'm going to just do a quick roughness pass on this guy for demonstration purposes. However, if you're thinking that this is going to be a little bit larger or integral piece on your asset, I would maybe put in a little bit more time to making sure that you have an interesting looking roughness like we've already learned how to do in this series so far. So I'm going to bring this back. I'm just going to get rid of our uniform color here. And I'm going to bring this in, switching him to a curvature smooth. And then I'm going to use a levels node. And so again, I want to just kind of invert our levels here. And I want to have a little bit of a different option between the roughness of my button and the roughness of my metal. So again, we can do this quite simply if we just duplicate this guy here so that we have two controls. And I'm going to bring this guy down here. And I'm going to blend these two together. And the only thing we're going to need to use, again, is our mask here. So now you can see that up top is going to be our button. And below is going to be our metal. So this is going to just give us more control over just the two different types of materials independently of each other. And it just gives a little bit more flexibility there. So I'm going to play around with our button. I maybe want it to be a little bit, make them a little glossy. Something like that. And I definitely want my metal to be a little bit shinier, right? It isn't like a shiny metal. So that's looking pretty good. Maybe just bring up the outputs so that can't get any pure black values, right? Because we're getting really, really shiny parts on the corners there, and it's starting to look not too hot. But something like that. That's looking really cool. That's starting to get a great look and design overall. Now there's one more output that I want to use on this light, and that kind of is in the name. I want to give it the ability to cast its own kind of light, right? Using an emission map. And so we need to go ahead and actually create that output. So we're going to do output. And I'm going to just come up here, call this emiss and our emission. And again, I'll put it in the material group, even though we don't actually have any outputs currently that will accept the emission. And I'm just going to change its type to emissive. So now, if whatever I plug in here is going to be used as basically a resource to indicate the lighting for this asset here. And so to do that, I'm going to come back and I'm going to find where this guy is that we use to actually create the mask for the button. And the reason I'm going to use this guy is because it gives us a little bit more of a gradient in terms of overall light intensity, whereas our mask here is just going to give us a full-on value. So I'm going to quickly create a gradient map here and drag this guy down to our emissive. And so if I just plug this guy in and right click and view outputs in 3D, you can see that we're going to get some, light basically pouring out from our asset here. But the problem is that because we've got our, basically our light value is white, it's going to be emitting white light. And anywhere that is black, well, black light doesn't really exist, right? It's kind of the absence of the light in this particular case. So any black values are just going to emit nothing. There's not going to be any light. So as long as we don't change this size independently of the actual geometry we've created over here, we should be fine to just leave it as it is. And so in our gradient, I'm going to come down and do our gradient editor here. If I click up in one of the corners, our handles are going to pop up. And so we can, again, play around kind of like the curves node here where we change our gradient. And I'm going to go ahead and with this guy selected, just choose kind of a reddish color, kind of a bright red. And we can maybe bring the black value up again. And you can see that what the black value is doing is it's just kind of closing in on the overall light intensity of our light here. And I kind of want to just, close it in kind of like it's a bit of a gradient into the center there. And that might be a little bit too much. Something kind of like that. Cool. And that's starting to look really neat. So with our decal now completed here, we're going to have to take a look at figuring out how we're going to be able to actually move this guy around, right, when we get it into our parent graph. Because the only real method of transformation that we have in our graph currently is if we come back to the beginning of our geometry over here. So if I scroll out here, remember that we can scale this guy up or down, and it will procedurally change the scale there. And we also have this transformation here, which is going to do a little bit to break our button. But beyond these two, we don't really have a method of being able to move this guy around on our texture set when we want to operate this on our actual finished material. So a node that's going to allow us to do that is the material transform node. If I come over here and just type in material transform, you can see with a little brief description that this node allows us to transform all of the channels of the material at the same time. And I'm going to bring this guy in. And if I come down, you can see that we get a whole bunch of different channel inputs and outputs there. And a lot of these we're not even going to use. So I can come into its parameters. And if I come down to our channels here, you can see that we've got diffuse. So we're not going to use a diffuse. I'm going to use our base color and normal. We're not going to need a specular. I'm going to turn our emissive on, right? Because remember, we actually included an emissive output. I'm going to turn off our glossiness, keep on the roughness and metallic, keep on our ambient occlusion, and I'm going to take off the height here. And so this is going to allow us to plug in all of our inputs here. And through this node, we're going to be able to transform all of those specific nodes or the specific connections, and then output those transforms pretty much in real time. And so we're not going to have to go through all of these different channels here and add a transform 2D node onto it and try and line everything up. This is just going to do it automatically for us. So I want to go ahead and I'm going to start plugging in our outputs here into this guy. So I'll take that and plug it in there. Take our normal and plug it into our normal. Our emissive over here happens to be right in the center there, so I'll plug that guy in there. Take our roughness and plug it into the roughness. Take our metallic and plug it in there. And take our ambient occlusion and plug that guy in there. So now I can start moving these back a little bit. And everything's back there, good. So you can see now that we've actually got this grouped, right? You can see those little black bar back there. So this is why I also made sure in our emissive here to plug that guy into our material group so that when I come over here and do our quick connections, it's going to plug into all of our outputs there. And you can see all of this information has come back. And if I click on this guy here, you can see if I come into my 2D viewer, and if I just double click on that to show that, I now have the ability to move this around, and it's going to move all of the channels that we've plugged into it simultaneously. And this is going to give us the power to actually move this guy around in our parent graph there. So I'm going to just bring that back to square 0 there. And I'm going to come into our megaphone. So I'm going to make sure that I come back to scene. You can see that our 3D asset has disappeared. So I'm just going to quickly find this guy and drag him back in. And so now I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to, drag these guys out. And now drag our light decal graph in here. And so now you can see kind of the first discrepancy in the setup that we have here is that we don't actually have any input parameters for this guy. So we're not going to be able to just situate it here and plug it in and then play around by plugging it out and play around with the position here. And instead, I just want to show you how we can also go about blending things in manually in our parent graph as well to give us a little bit more control. And it's just a different way of setting up our graph here. Again, you could have totally on your own time gone ahead and just included those inputs. But for the sake of demonstration, I just decided to leave that out. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to start blending in our base color here. So I'm going to do a blend. And I'm going to take our base color and I'm going to plug that guy in. And you can see immediately, right, we're going to get a bit of an issue because all we've done is taken this guy here and plugged it in over top. So this is going to give us a bit of an issue because we're going to need a way to actually mask off this guy here when we start blending it in with all of our outputs here. So I'm going to come back into here and I'm going to try and find a way that we can export a mask for our entire decal here. And so the last area that we have our geometry is this node right here. Remember where we plugged in kind of the noise or the patterns for the button here? And so what I'm going to do is just drag this out and do a histogram scan node because remember, this guy here has pretty much a pixel with some kind of grayscale value that is non-black. So we should be able to capture that with our histogram scan here. So if I take that guy up there, you can see that we're getting a little bit of a black ring. So it means that those are some black pixels. So if I just click on this guy here, and I believe, is it this guy right here? Nope. Is it, let's take a look here. Maybe we'll just play around with this. All right, let's see. Is this going to fix a little bit of our issue here? Oh, and it's the blend just between those guys there. So let's take a look and maybe decrease that gap there. So now if I take a look, you can see that that's gone. And how has that changed our geometry? Nothing really at all. We just want to make sure that there's no pure black areas in our height here so that we can capture it with our histogram. So I'm glad that I had that issue so you guys can see that. So I'm going to take this guy and bring him over, and this is our final mask for the entirety of this little button here. And before I make an output, I want to make sure that we can capture this mask in our material transform. So I'm going to come back into this guy, and I'm going to come down, and I'm going to just click on our opacity. And so even though we're not actually using this as an opacity per se, we are using it as a mask, and I guess we are kind of using it as an opacity for our blend node. The names of these don't really matter too much as long as you're using the appropriate color space, right? And so opacity is going to be a grayscale socket there. So I can plug that guy in, and I'm going to come down and add a new output. I'm going to call this, we can just call this opacity, and I'm going to call this opacity. You can call it mask or whatever you want. Again, add it to material just in case. And I'm going to come and change it to just an opacity use. Now, we don't really need to set that up too much because at the end of the day, we aren't using this so much as an opacity for the material itself, but rather just to carry on using it as a mask. But we can still use that as opacity. And you can see if I view this output in 3D, it's going to actually make all the other stuff disappear because we're using the opacity output, but that's totally fine. We don't need to worry about that too much because if I come back up to my parent graph here, you can see that we've got all of these outputs here now, and we've got our opacity. So if I view outputs in 3D in our parent graph here, and I use this opacity, now we're going to be able to have this guy show up without affecting any of the other areas of our texture set. So that's pretty cool. So I'm going to go ahead and just set up all of our other blends here. So for our normal map, I'm going to do a normal blend this time. So in previous videos, we've been doing a normal combine because I want to combine the normals of our base mesh so that they're working together and we're able to see kind of an overlay of the two of them, right? Well, in this particular instance, I actually want the normals that we generated from our button here to overlap the normals of this guy so that we don't get to see any of the normals underneath on our mesh here. So I'm going to plug my normal in, and we're not going to get anything immediately showing up. But if I plug in my opacity or my mask, now you can see that the normals of our button here are going to show up over top of the normals that we have from our base mesh. And so that's going to allow us to kind of disregard any of those normals underneath. On the next one for our roughness, I'm going to add a blend. And again, just selecting the roughness and selecting our mask. And the process is pretty similar for the rest of these guys here, just adding another blend for our metallic, bringing that in and using the mask. And lastly, we're going to add another blend for our ambient occlusion. Take the ambient occlusion from up here, and we're also going to blend that in with a mask. So now all of these channels are getting our little light button showing up as its kind of own independent entity from the rest of it. and it's bringing with it its own information to contribute to all those channels. And so I want to come back into that graph, and I just want to expose the ability to now transfer this guy around. And I'm going to expose this guy here, and this is going to be our matrix. And I'm going to expose this guy down here as well, and this is our offset. So now when I come back into our parent graph and I select this guy here, you can see we have all those transformation objects. So now when I start dragging this guy around, you can see that we're going to be able to play around with this. And I also want to make sure that when I bring this guy down, that we're not going to get any tiling of any sort. So I'm just going to come back into our graph. Make sure that we have this guy selected for no tiling there. So now if I come in and play around with this, we should not get any tiling. Perfect. So if I make this guy a little bit smaller now, you can see what it's going to do if I bring it up over on top of here somewhere, is we're going to have the ability now to pretty much place this decal anywhere we want, right? And like I said in an earlier tutorial, I kind of want to place it just right down there. So again, we come down over here and just crush this guy in. We can start to play around with the placement of this guy. So I want to make sure that, I don't want to drag the origin there. I just want to make sure that this is as over top as possible, and I might have to bring this down just a little bit more. I just want to make sure that this is, yeah, pretty centered there. So that's looking pretty cool. And so we've got this little button, right, that we've added and created procedurally, and we can place another one if we wanted to go ahead and set up another blending state there that's going to allow us to place these buttons wherever we want. And now I also need to make sure to include our final output here, which is going to be our emission, so that we can actually see the emissive state of this button here. So I'm going to do emiss again, call this emission, and add this to our material group. And so when I go to the add button and do emissive, we can view this in 3D here. And when I bring the emission from our node here and place that guy down, now you can see that we're going to get some emission showing up for our little button there, and that's pretty cool. So in this tutorial, we've taken a look at just going ahead and creating a little bit of procedural geometry that we can use to further accentuate parts of our material and go ahead and create more interesting and intricate features that we maybe weren't able to get from our high poly mesh. In the next tutorial, we're going to take a look at how we're going to take our entire material that we have so far and be able to add a little bit more intrigue to the grunginess and the roughness of our asset here, and just help us kind of consolidate the look and the feel of it and all of the materials so that they feel a little bit more close to fitting together on one asset.